Ayanna. Little Feather dropped her morning coffee, the ceramic mug shattering against the porch steps as she watched the massive black bear 50 yards away clawing desperately at something white and twisted. The bear wasn't foraging, she was fighting to free whatever was trapped inside that industrial plastic bag. A muffled cry echoed from within the sealed material, high-pitched and terrified, the unmistakable sound of something young and dying. Ayanna's weathered hands flew to her mouth as the terrible realization hit her. There was a baby inside that bag, and time was running out. The mother bear's frantic movements grew weaker with each passing second, her massive paws unable to tear through the heat-sealed plastic that some monster had wrapped around her cub. She looked up suddenly, her dark eyes finding Ayanna across the clearing. Not with aggression, but with something that made the old Cherokee woman's heart shatter. It was the same look Ayanna had seen in her own mirror the morning she buried her son, a plea for help from one mother to another. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Ayanna. Little Feather had been walking these Cherokee hills for 65 years, but she'd never felt as alone as she did this October morning. The foreclosure notice lay crumpled on her kitchen table, 30 days to pay $47,000 in medical debt or lose the last 40 acres of her family's ancestral land. George's heart attack had taken more than her husband. It had taken her future, her hope, and her reason to keep fighting. She set 2 coffee cups on the weathered porch table every sunrise, a habit she couldn't break even 8 months after the funeral. "Morning, George," she whispered to the empty chair, her voice carrying across the silent valley. "The lawyers called again yesterday. They're coming for the land." The October wind stirred the oak leaves, but her husband didn't answer. He never did anymore. 20 miles away, Joseph Whitehorse jerked awake in his ranger cabin as the sound of helicopter rotors thundered overhead. His heart hammered against his ribs, sweat soaking through his shirt as the familiar nightmare gripped him, dust, blood, and the screaming of his squad in Kandahar. The chopper passed, heading toward the logging sites, but Joe's hands still trembled as he reached for the coffee pot. 2 years sober and the empty bourbon bottles in his trash still called to him every morning. On his desk, a photograph of his daughter lay face down. She hadn't spoken to him since Marcus Littlefeather's funeral, the night Joe was supposed to meet his best friend, the night he'd chosen a bottle instead. In downtown Asheville, Thomas Raincloud adjusted his silk tie and studied the contract spread across his mahogany desk. To anyone watching, he was just another successful Cherokee businessman, his construction company worth millions. But the documents hidden in his office safe told a different story. For 6 months, he'd been secretly working with environmental lawyers, using his apparent alliance with Apex Logging Company to gather evidence of their illegal practices. The childhood photographs tucked behind legal papers showed a skinny boy with sad eyes standing beside a Cherokee woman who'd called him son. Before the community made it clear that adopted children, especially those with mixed blood, would never truly belong. Each morning all 3 carried the same weight, the crushing loneliness of those who'd lost everything that mattered. Ayanna spoke to ghosts, Joe fought invisible wars, and Tommy wore masks that grew heavier each day. They moved through their separate worlds, unaware that their paths would soon converge on sacred ground, bound together by an ancient covenant between protector and protected. The land remembered what they'd forgotten, that some bonds transcend blood, some families are chosen by the spirits themselves, and sometimes salvation comes not from strength, but from the courage to let others see your wounds. In a few hours, a mother's desperate love would strip away their masks and force them to remember who they truly were beneath the pain. The morning mist was lifting from the valley, and destiny was already stirring in the forest. Ayanna's bare feet hit the cold earth as she ran toward the clearing. her heart pounding with a rhythm she hadn't felt since the night Marcus was born. The mother bear looked up at her approach but didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped back from the plastic-wrapped bundle, her massive body trembling with exhaustion and desperation. "Easy, Mama," Ayanna whispered in Cherokee, her voice carrying the ancient cadence her grandmother had taught her for speaking to wild things. "Grandmother is here to help." The bear's dark eyes never left hers, and in that gaze Ayanna saw something that made her throat tighten, pure, desperate trust from one mother to another. The plastic bag was industrial grade, heat-sealed with military precision. Through the clouded material, Ayanna could see the small form inside barely moving, tiny paws pressed against the suffocating barrier. The cub's breathing was shallow, rapid, failing. She pulled her grandfather's hunting knife from her pocket, hands steadier than they'd been in months as she began the delicate work of cutting through layer after layer without harming the precious life within. "Stay with me, little one," she murmured, working carefully around what looked like a breathing hole someone had deliberately left. This wasn't random cruelty. This was calculated, methodical. Someone had wanted this cub to survive long enough to suffer. The plastic bore a small logo in the corner: Apex Logging Company. As the final layer fell away, the cub took his first full breath in hours, a tiny gasp that seemed to echo through the entire forest. He was beautiful, maybe 4 months old, with intelligent dark eyes and fur so black it seemed to absorb the morning light. His little body was weak but uninjured, and when Ayanna gently lifted him, he didn't struggle. Instead, he nestled against her chest like he'd been waiting for her his whole short life. The mother bear made a sound Ayanna had never heard before, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. It wasn't a growl or a warning, but something deeper, older: recognition, gratitude, and something else that made Ayanna's breath catch: the sound of a mother saying goodbye. That's when she heard the ATV engine. The machine burst through the tree line like an angry wasp, kicking up dirt and fallen leaves. The driver was a man in his 40s, wearing expensive outdoor gear that looked fresh from the store. His face was set in hard lines, but when he saw Ayanna holding the cub, his expression shifted to something like panic. "Step away from the bear!" he called out, climbing off the ATV with movements that spoke of desperation rather than authority. "That animal is dangerous." Ayanna stood slowly, the cub still cradled against her chest. The mother bear positioned herself between them and the newcomer, not aggressive, but protective. "This cub was trapped," Ayanna said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with men who thought they knew better. "Someone wrapped him in plastic and left him to die." The man's eyes flicked to the discarded plastic, then to the logo visible on one torn piece. Something crossed his face: guilt, recognition, fear. "I can explain that," he said quickly. "I was trying to help. I found him like that." "With industrial plastic that has your company's logo on it?" Ayanna's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "With heat sealing that requires special equipment?" The man stepped forward, and the mother bear's posture shifted subtly. She didn't growl or rear up, but every line of her body spoke of a parent willing to die for her child. "Ma'am, you don't understand the situation here. There are things happening in these woods." "I understand perfectly," Ayanna interrupted. "Someone is setting traps. Someone is hurting innocent animals. And someone," she looked pointedly at his Apex logging jacket, "is trying to clear this land by making it seem too dangerous for environmental protection." The man's face went pale. "You can't prove anything." "Can't I?" Ayanna pulled out her phone with one hand, keeping the cub secure with the other. "Cherokee Nation has federal recognition. Crimes against wildlife on treaty land fall under federal jurisdiction. Would you like to explain to the FBI why this cub was wrapped in your company's materials?" The ATV engine was still running, and for a moment the man looked like he might flee. But then another sound cut through the morning air, the rumble of a Park Service truck making its way up the old logging road. Help was coming, but Ayanna wasn't sure if it was for her or for the man whose hands were now shaking as he stared at the evidence of his cruelty scattered on the forest floor. The mother bear lifted her great head, scenting the wind, and made that deep sound again. This time, Ayanna understood. It wasn't goodbye, it was a promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The Park Service truck rolled to a stop with the mechanical groan of well-worn brakes, and Joseph Whitehorse stepped out like a man walking into battle. His ranger uniform was crisp, his badge polished, but his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much death. When he spotted the standoff in the clearing, an elderly Cherokee woman holding a bear cub, while a massive sow watched, and a nervous man in logging gear shifted weight from foot to foot. Every instinct from his military training kicked into high alert. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from that animal," Joe called out, his hand instinctively moving toward the tranquilizer gun on his belt. But something in the woman's posture stopped him cold. She stood like someone protecting family, not like someone in danger. And the mother bear, Joe had seen enough black bears to know when they were aggressive. This one was watchful, protective, but not threatening. "Officer Whitehorse," Ayanna said, recognizing the name from his uniform badge. "I called for help, but not the kind you're thinking." She shifted the cub slightly so Joe could see his face. This baby was trapped in industrial plastic, deliberately sealed. Someone wanted him to suffer. The man in the Apex jacket, Tommy, according to the name embroidered above his company logo, took a step forward. "Officer, this woman is interfering with a legitimate wildlife management operation. That bear attacked our equipment yesterday, and we were attempting to relocate the cub safely." Joe's trained eye swept the scene, cataloging details the way he'd learned to do in Afghanistan: torn plastic with heat-sealed edges, Apex logging logo, the cub's obvious dehydration and weakness, the mother bear's defensive but non-aggressive posture, and something else, something about the man named Tommy, that nagged at the edge of his memory. "Relocate with what appears to be a suffocation device?" Joe's voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to cutting through lies. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some documentation for this wildlife management operation." Tommy's face flushed. "I don't have to show you anything. This is private land under development contract." "Actually," Ayanna said quietly, "this is treaty land. Cherokee Nation territory under federal protection, which means any wildlife crimes here fall under my jurisdiction as much as his." She nodded toward Joe. "And I'm telling you, Officer Whitehorse, this man is lying." The standoff might have continued, but the mother bear chose that moment to do something extraordinary. She walked slowly toward Joe, stopping just out of arm's reach, and sat down. Then she looked directly at him and made a soft, huffing sound. Not aggressive, not warning, but something almost like conversation. Joe had been working with wildlife for 12 years, but he'd never seen behavior like this. The bear was communicating, asking for help. "Ma'am," he said to Ayanna, his voice softer now. "How long has she been doing that?" "Since sunrise. She brought him to me, led me to him, like she knew I would help." Ayanna's eyes never left Joe's face. "Animals know things, officer. They know who they can trust." That's when the helicopter sound started again. Joe's body went rigid, his breathing shallow, as the familiar thump, thump, thump grew louder. But instead of hitting the deck or reaching for cover, he forced himself to focus on the present moment. The cub in the old woman's arms, the mother bear watching him with intelligent eyes, the nervous man whose story wasn't adding up. "I need you to step away from the bears, ma'am," he said again. But his tone had changed. This wasn't a command. It was a request. Not because they're dangerous, but because I think we're about to have company, and I want you safe. The helicopter was getting closer, and Tommy was looking increasingly panicked. Look, this is getting out of hand. I just need to take the cub and— You're not taking anything, Joe cut him off. The memory was crystallizing now. He'd seen this man before, years ago at a funeral. Marcus Littlefeather's funeral. But Tommy looked different now. Older. Harder. What's your full name, sir? Thomas Raincloud. I work for Apex as a site supervisor. Ayanna's head snapped up. Raincloud? The name seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her grip on the cub tightened protectively. Thomas Raincloud? Something passed between them. Recognition, disbelief, pain. Joe could see it in their faces, the way people look when ghosts walk out of their past and demand to be acknowledged. You know him? Joe asked. Ayanna's voice caught. I thought he was dead. The helicopter was directly overhead now, its rotors whipping the fallen leaves into a frenzy. Through the noise, Joe could hear more ATVs approaching from multiple directions. Whatever was happening here was bigger than one trapped cub, bigger than one lying supervisor. Tommy was backing toward his ATV, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. I can't. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. What wasn't supposed to happen? Joe shouted over the helicopter noise. What are you really doing here? The mother bear stood up, sensing the change in energy, the approaching danger. She looked at her cub in Ayanna's arms, then at the circling helicopter, then back at the woman who'd saved her baby. The message was clear. Protect him. Whatever's coming, Ayanna said, holding the cub closer. We face it together. She looked directly at Tommy. All of us. Like family should. Tommy's face crumpled. You don't understand. They'll kill you all if they find out what I've been doing. The bears, you, him. He gestured toward Joe. Everyone's expendable except the profit margin. The first ATV burst through the trees, followed by two more, men in tactical gear, moving with military precision, and suddenly Joe understood. This wasn't about wildlife management or even illegal logging. This was about something much more dangerous. Get behind the truck, he ordered Ayanna. Now! The 3 days that followed changed everything Ayanna thought she knew about trust, family, and the sacred bonds that connect all living things. What began as a rescue mission had transformed into something deeper, a careful dance of healing between broken souls who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. Ayanna's cabin became a sanctuary within a sanctuary. The bear cub, whom she'd named Enola, Black Fox in Cherokee, had claimed the space beside her rocking chair as his own territory. He was stronger now, his breathing deep and regular, his dark eyes bright with the curiosity of youth. But it was his behavior that amazed her most. Enola responded to Cherokee words as if he understood not just the sounds, but the spirit behind them. When she sang the old lullabies her grandmother had taught her, he would curl up against her feet and make soft, huffing sounds that seemed almost like purring. You're not just any bear, are you, little one? She whispered on the second evening, watching him carefully arrange pine cones in precise patterns across her living room floor. Intelligence sparkled in his movements, a deliberate problem-solving approach that reminded her achingly of Marcus at that age, always organizing his toys into elaborate systems only he understood. Outside, Joe had set up what he called a protective perimeter, though Ayanna suspected it was more about giving himself a sense of purpose than any real security threat. The helicopter visits had stopped after Tommy made some tense phone calls to his contacts at Apex, claiming the wildlife situation was under control. but Joe's military training wouldn't let him relax. She'd watched him check the same sight lines 15 times each morning, his body rigid with hypervigilance that spoke of old wounds still bleeding. On the second night, she'd found him sitting on her porch at 3 a.m., staring into the darkness with haunted eyes. "Can't sleep?" she'd asked, settling into the chair beside him with 2 cups of chamomile tea. "Sleep's overrated," he'd replied, but accepted the tea gratefully. "Besides, someone needs to keep watch. The only danger out there is in your memories, Joe Whitehorse." Her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades reading people's pain. "What happened over there?" For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in the halting voice of someone unused to sharing his burdens, he told her about Kandahar, about the IED that took his entire squad while he was back at base with food poisoning, about the survivor's guilt that followed him home like a shadow, about the drinking that cost him his marriage and his relationship with his daughter. "I was supposed to be with them," he said finally. "Should have died with my brothers instead of coming home broken." Ayanna had listened without judgment, the way her grandmother had taught her to listen to confessions whispered in the darkness. "The spirits don't make mistakes, Joe. You're here because you have work left to do. Maybe this—" She gestured toward the cabin where Enola slept peacefully. "Maybe this is what you came home for." Tommy's presence remained the most complicated element of their strange new family dynamic. He arrived each morning at sunrise and stayed until well past sunset, ostensibly to coordinate with Apex about the resolved wildlife issue. But Ayanna could see the truth in his restless movements, the way his eyes lingered on familiar objects in her cabin. He was a man coming home to a place he'd thought lost forever. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day, when Enola did something that shattered the last of Tommy's carefully constructed walls. The cub had been exploring the cabin with his usual methodical curiosity when he discovered a cardboard box tucked behind Ayanna's rocking chair. Inside were Marcus's childhood belongings: his first baseball glove, his collection of arrowheads, a wooden horse carved by his father. Enola pulled out the wooden horse and carried it directly to Tommy, dropping it at his feet with the deliberate precision of a gift. Tommy stared at the toy for a long moment, his hands trembling as he picked it up. "I made this," he whispered. "When I was 8 years old, Marcus said it was his favorite." He looked up at Ayanna with tears streaming down his face. "How did he know?" "Animals see what we try to hide," Ayanna said gently. "They know family, even when family has forgotten itself." That night, as rain drummed against the cabin roof, Tommy finally told his story. How he'd been adopted by Ayanna and George when he was 7, after his birth parents died in a car accident. How he'd tried desperately to fit in with the Cherokee community, but had always felt like an outsider looking in. How the older boys had called him not Indian and fake Cherokee until he'd started believing it himself. "The night Marcus died," Tommy said, his voice barely audible above the rain, "I was supposed to meet both of you at the hospital. I was coming home to tell you I'd finally made something of myself that maybe I could be a son you'd be proud of. But when I heard about the accident," he couldn't finish. "You thought we blamed you," Ayanna said, understanding flooding through her, "for not being there, for not dying instead. Didn't you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ayanna reached across the space between them and took his hands in hers, hands that were calloused from honest work, hands that had built a successful business from nothing, hands that belonged to the boy who'd once carved wooden horses for his little brother. "Thomas Raincloud," she said formally, using the Cherokee naming cadence her grandmother had taught her. "You are my son. You have always been my son, not because of blood or law or any paper signed by judges, but because you chose to love us and let us love you. The spirits don't make mistakes about family. Joe, who'd been quietly listening from the kitchen, cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, Marcus talked about you all the time. His big brother who was going to change the world. He never stopped believing you'd come home." Outside, the mother bear had maintained her vigil. She'd claimed a sheltered spot near Ayana's woodshed, close enough to keep watch over her cub, but far enough to respect the human boundaries. Each evening, Ayana left food and fresh water on the porch, not as charity, but as the kind of neighborly courtesy one extended to family temporarily staying nearby. The bear's presence had become a source of comfort rather than concern. She seemed to understand that her cub was safe, that these particular humans could be trusted with the most precious thing in her world. Sometimes in the early morning hours, Ayana would see her playing with Enola in the meadow behind the cabin, teaching him to catch fish in the stream, showing him which berries were safe to eat, demonstrating the ancient skills that would keep him alive in the wild. It was during one of these teaching sessions that Joe made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been photographing the bears for what he claimed were wildlife documentation purposes. But Ayana suspected he simply found peace in watching their interactions. As he reviewed the photos on his camera, something in the mother bear's movement patterns triggered a memory. "Ayana!" he called, excitement and disbelief warring in his voice. "I need you to look at something." The photograph showed the mother bear in profile, revealing a distinctive scar along her left shoulder, 3 parallel lines that could only have come from barbed wire. Joe scrolled to another photo, this one from his files 15 years ago, showing a young bear cub being released after treatment for severe lacerations. "It's her," he breathed. "She's the cub you rescued all those years ago. She's come home." The revelation hit Ayana like lightning. She remembered that day vividly. The young bear caught in illegal fencing, bleeding and terrified. She'd spent weeks nursing her back to health before releasing her into the protected areas deeper in the forest. Now that cub had grown up, had cubs of her own, and when crisis struck, she'd known exactly where to bring her baby for help. "Circle of life," Tommy said wonderfully, scratching Enola behind the ears as the cub arranged Tommy's business cards into neat piles. She remembered kindness and returned it, but their peaceful bubble was about to be shattered. On the evening of the 3rd day, Tommy's phone rang with the harsh electronic intrusion that marked the outside world demanding attention. The conversation was brief, tense, conducted in the clipped tones of someone receiving orders they didn't want to follow. When he hung up, his face was grave. "Apex is starting the logging operation tomorrow at dawn. Full crew, heavy machinery, military-style security. They're done waiting." "Can't you stop them?" Joe asked. "You're their site supervisor." "That was my boss. I've been reassigned, permanently. They're bringing in their own people to handle what they're calling the Cherokee problem." Tommy's hands clenched into fists. "They know I've been feeding information to environmental groups. They know about the evidence I've gathered on their illegal trapping operations. And they know about you too." Ayana felt the familiar weight of loss settling over her shoulders like a shroud. "So we lose. The land, the animals, everything." She looked down at Enola, who was staring up at her with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "What happens to the bears?" "Relocation, if they're lucky," Joe said grimly. "But bears this habituated to human contact." He didn't need to finish. They all knew what happened to wild animals deemed too comfortable around people. Tommy stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he stared out at the mother bear keeping her patient vigil. "There might be a way," he said slowly, "but it would require trusting me completely, and it would put all of us at risk." "What kind of risk?" Ayana asked. "The kind where we might not walk away." Tommy turned back to face them, and in his expression Ayana saw echoes of the determined little boy who'd once spent 3 days building a fort to protect an injured bird. But if it works, we could save the land, expose Apex's illegal operations, and protect every bear family in these mountains. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, not from any approaching storm, but from the heavy machinery already being positioned at the forest's edge. Time was running out, and tomorrow would bring either salvation or the destruction of everything they'd fought to protect. Enola looked up from his latest engineering project, a complex structure built from pine cones and Thomas's scattered business cards, and made a soft sound that somehow conveyed both trust and determination. Whatever came next, they would face it as family. The real battle was about to begin. Dawn came like a war zone, the forest floor trembling under the weight of industrial machinery rolling through what had been sacred silence just hours before. Ayanna woke to the sound of diesel engines and men shouting orders. The peaceful sanctuary of her cabin suddenly transformed into the front line of a battle she wasn't sure they could win. Tommy had arrived before first light, his face grim with the knowledge of what they were about to attempt. "The logging crews are setting up a perimeter," he reported, spreading hand-drawn maps across Ayanna's kitchen table. "But they don't know about the old mining tunnels that connect the ravines. If we can get to the main equipment depot before they fully deploy—" "This is insane," Joe interrupted, checking his service weapon for the third time in 10 minutes. His military training was warring with his law enforcement protocols, and the tension showed in every line of his body. "We're talking about interfering with a legal operation on private land." "Legal doesn't mean right," Ayanna said quietly, cradling Enola against her chest. The cub had been restless all night, sensing the approaching danger with the intuitive awareness that wild things possessed. "And this isn't private land, it's stolen land, held by companies that bought it from people who had no right to sell what was never theirs." Outside, the mother bear was pacing at the edge of the tree line, her massive form silhouetted against the growing light. She knew something was wrong, could smell the diesel fumes, and hear the mechanical intrusion into her world. Her agitation was palpable, a wild thing watching civilization prepare to destroy everything she'd fought to protect. The first bulldozer came into view at 6:47 a.m., its yellow bulk moving through the forest like a mechanical predator. Behind it followed a convoy of logging trucks, equipment haulers, and security vehicles filled with men who looked more like mercenaries than forestry workers. Apex wasn't taking any chances this time. "There," Tommy pointed to a black SUV near the center of the convoy. "That's Marcus Brennan, Apex's head of security, former military contractor, specializes in what they call hostile environment operations. If he's here personally, it means they're expecting serious resistance." Joe's jaw tightened. What kind of resistance? "The kind where environmental protesters sometimes have accidents in remote locations," Tommy said grimly. "The kind where evidence disappears and witnesses develop sudden amnesia about what they've seen." Ayanna felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. "They'd kill us?" "In a heartbeat if it protects their investment. This logging contract is worth $47 million over 5 years. They're not going to let 3 people and some bears stand in their way." But even as he spoke, Tommy was moving with the focused determination of someone who'd already made his choice. He pulled a thick envelope from his jacket pocket and spread its contents across the table: photographs, documents, recorded conversations transcribed onto paper. 6 months of evidence, he said. Every illegal trap, every forged permit, every bribe they've paid to local officials. Everything we need to shut them down permanently. He looked directly at Ayanna. "But it has to get to the right people, and we have about 30 minutes before they complete their security sweep and find us." The sound of chainsaws starting up echoed through the forest like mechanical screaming. Somewhere in the distance, ancient trees that had stood for centuries were beginning to fall. Joe was studying the documents with the focused intensity of someone trained to process critical information under pressure. "This is enough to bring federal charges," he said. "RICO violations, environmental crimes, conspiracy to commit fraud, but only if we can get it to someone with jurisdiction and authority to act." "My contact at the FBI field office in Asheville," Tommy said. "Agent Sarah Chen, Environmental Crimes Division. She's been investigating Apex for 2 years, but she needed inside evidence to make charges stick." "Great," Joe said. "How do we get 40 pages of evidence to the FBI when we're surrounded by armed security contractors who want us dead?" That's when Ayanna stood up, her decision crystallizing with the quiet certainty that came from a lifetime of choosing love over fear. "We don't run," she said simply. "We make them come to us." Both men stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Ayanna," Tommy said carefully, "these aren't people you negotiate with. They solve problems by making them disappear. Then we make sure the whole world is watching when they try." She moved to her laptop, fingers flying over keys with surprising speed for someone her age. "Cherokee Nation has social media accounts with over 2 million followers. The Tribal Council has been documenting every attempt to illegally exploit our land for years." Joe caught on first. "Live stream." "Live stream," Ayanna confirmed. "Let them try to make 3 people disappear while half the internet watches in real time." The plan that emerged was desperate, dangerous, and absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. Tommy would use his access to the logging operation to plant hidden cameras at key locations. Joe would coordinate with his Park Service contacts to establish legal jurisdiction grounds, and Ayanna would do what Cherokee grandmothers had been doing for centuries. She would tell a story that the world needed to hear. By 7:30 a.m., they were ready. Ayanna sat on her porch with Enola in her lap, her laptop streaming live video to Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube simultaneously. The mother bear had positioned herself at the edge of camera range, a powerful presence that needed no introduction. "Good morning," Ayanna said to the camera, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone speaking absolute truth. "My name is Ayanna Littlefeather, and I'm a 65-year-old Cherokee grandmother. In about 20 minutes, armed contractors working for Apex Logging Company are going to arrive at my home to force me off land that has belonged to my family for over 200 years. The viewer count was climbing steadily. Hundreds, then thousands of people tuning in to watch an elderly Native American woman sitting peacefully with a bear cub while chainsaws roared in the background. "They're not just taking our trees," she continued, gently stroking Enola's fur as he dozed in her lap. "They're destroying an entire ecosystem that includes 47 black bear families, nesting sites for 17 endangered bird species, and sacred burial grounds where my ancestors rest." Joe's voice crackled through the radio. "Security team moving up the access road. 6 vehicles, approximately 24 personnel. ETA 12 minutes. Ayanna didn't flinch. "For the past 3 days, my son Tommy and Ranger Joe Whitehorse have been documenting evidence of systematic animal cruelty, environmental crimes, and corruption by Apex Logging. We have photographs, documents, and recorded conversations proving that this company has been deliberately torturing wildlife to drive away environmental protesters." The comment section exploded with outrage, shares multiplying exponentially as the story spread across social networks. Local news stations were picking up the feed, and Ayanna could see the viewer count approaching 50,000. Tommy's voice came through the radio. "Package delivered to Agent Chen. She's 20 minutes out with a federal warrant, but Brennan's team will be here in 8 minutes. The beautiful cub you see sleeping in my arms was found wrapped in industrial plastic, left to suffocate as a message to anyone who might dare to protect these forests. Ayanna continued. His mother, that magnificent bear you can see behind me, brought him to me because she knew something that apex logging doesn't understand. Love doesn't make you weak. Love makes you dangerous. The black SUVs were visible now, moving up the dirt road like sharks approaching wounded prey. Ayanna could make out the lead vehicle's occupants, hard men with harder eyes, the kind of people who solved problems with violence and never looked back. In Cherokee tradition, Ayanna said, her voice steady despite the approaching danger, we believe that land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. We are its guardians, its voice, its memory. And today, over 60,000 of you are witnessing what happens when corporate greed tries to silence that voice forever. The SUVs had stopped at her property line, and men in tactical gear were deploying with military precision. But something had changed. Instead of the quick, brutal operation they'd planned, they found themselves facing cameras, witnesses, and a viral story that was spreading faster than they could contain it. Brennan himself stepped out of the lead vehicle, his scarred face twisting with frustration as he realized his operation had been compromised. He approached the porch with the swagger of someone accustomed to intimidating civilians, but stopped short when he saw the laptop screen showing over 70,000 live viewers. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying false courtesy stretched over barely controlled rage, "you need to stop this broadcast and come with us. Now." Ayanna looked directly into the camera. And there he is, everyone. Marcus Brennan, head of security for Apex Logging, asking me to quietly disappear so his company can destroy sacred land for profit. The viewer count hit 100,000. Brennan's hand moved toward his weapon, then stopped as he realized that drawing on an elderly woman while 100,000 people watched would end more than just her resistance. It would end his company. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled. Ayanna smiled, the expression of someone who'd finally found her purpose. "I know exactly what I've done. I've made sure the whole world is watching." The sound of federal helicopters approaching from the east confirmed that sometimes love really was the most dangerous force in the world. The federal helicopters circling overhead should have been the cavalry arriving just in time, but Marcus Brennan wasn't the kind of man who surrendered easily. As Agent Sarah Chen's voice crackled through bullhorns demanding immediate cessation of all logging activities, Brennan made a decision that would haunt Ayanna's nightmares for the rest of her life. "If we can't have the land," he said into his radio, his voice carrying the cold calculation of someone who'd crossed too many lines to turn back now, "then nobody can execute Protocol 7. Ayanna didn't understand what Protocol 7 meant until she saw the mother bear's reaction. The massive animal suddenly reared up on her hind legs, every instinct screaming danger as the sound of high-powered rifles being chambered echoed through the forest. She wasn't just protecting her cub anymore. She was defending the sacred ground where generations of her kind had found safety. "No," Ayanna whispered, clutching Enola tighter to her chest as the horrible realization dawned. "They're going to kill her." Joe's voice exploded through the radio. "Brennan's ordered his men to eliminate all wildlife in the area. Says it's necessary for personnel safety during federal intervention. They're claiming the bears are aggressive and pose an imminent threat." The live stream viewer count had climbed to over 200,000 people, all watching in real time as one of nature's most magnificent creatures faced down armed men who saw her only as an obstacle to profit. The mother bear didn't understand the weapons pointed at her, but she understood threat, and her response was everything Ayanna had come to love about her fierce protective spirit. Instead of fleeing, she positioned herself directly between the armed men and Ayanna's porch, between the weapons and her cub. Between corporate greed and the sacred land her ancestors had protected for countless generations. "She's not attacking," Ayanna said desperately into the camera, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. "Look at her! She's protecting us! She's protecting her baby!" But Brennan's men weren't interested in animal behavior or the testimony of an elderly Cherokee woman. They were following orders from a man whose career depended on silencing anyone who threatened Apex Logging's bottom line. The first shot rang out like thunder, echoing off the mountain walls with the finality of a judge's gavel. The mother bear staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, she turned toward Ayanna with eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom and sorrow of the wild places being lost to machines and greed. In that gaze, Ayanna saw her own reflection, a mother who'd failed to protect what mattered most, watching helplessly as everything she loved was torn away. The second shot found its mark. The great bear fell with the weight of centuries, her massive body hitting the earth like a monument toppling. But even as life fled from her, she kept her eyes fixed on the porch where her cub rested safely in grandmother's arms. Her final act was a message of trust, a mother's last gift to another mother. Enola's cry of anguish pierced the morning air like a blade through silk. The sound was unlike anything Ayanna had ever heard, part whimper, part wail, part soul-deep keening for a loss too enormous to comprehend. He struggled in her arms, desperate to reach his fallen mother, his small body trembling with grief that transcended species. "Mama," Ayanna whispered, the Cherokee word for mother slipping from her lips like a prayer. "I'm so sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." The live stream exploded with outrage. 230,000 people had just witnessed the cold-blooded murder of a protective mother, and their fury crashed against social media platforms like a digital tsunami. #JusticeFor. Mama Bear began trending within minutes, accompanied by #ProtectAyanna and #StopApexLogging. But the viral fury of the internet couldn't bring back the magnificent creature whose only crime had been loving her child enough to trust human strangers with his life. Brennan stood over the bear's body with the satisfied expression of someone who'd eliminated a problem, seemingly unaware that he'd just created a much larger one. "Brennan!" Agent Chen's voice cut through the shocked silence like a whip crack. "You are under federal arrest for violations of the Endangered Species Act, conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, and murder of protected wildlife on treaty land." The bear was aggressive, Brennan replied coldly, holstering his smoking weapon. "My men acted in self-defense during a legitimate business operation." "Legitimate?" Tommy's voice cracked as he emerged from the tree line, his face a mask of rage and grief. "You just murdered a mother protecting her child while 200,000 people watched. What part of that seems legitimate to you?" Brennan's smile was the expression of a predator who'd spent years perfecting the art of legal brutality. "The part where my lawyers argue that environmental terrorists staged this entire event to interfere with lawful commerce. The part where a federal jury sees edited footage of dangerous wildlife threatening innocent workers. The part where 3 troublemakers disappear into the system and emerge as convicted eco-terrorists serving 20-year sentences." The casual cruelty in his voice sent ice through Ayanna's veins. This wasn't just about logging rights or environmental protection anymore. This was about a system so corrupted by greed that it could justify any atrocity in service of profit margins. Joe appeared beside Tommy, his ranger uniform torn and his face grim with the knowledge of battles fought and lost. "Federal agents are securing the area," he reported, but Brennan's team destroyed most of the physical evidence before Chen arrived. The traps, the documentation, even the plastic we found Enola in. It's all gone. "Not all of it," Tommy said grimly, pulling out his phone. "I live-streamed everything from the equipment depot. Every illegal trap, Every piece of evidence, every conversation where Brennan's men talked about disposing of problems. It's all on the cloud, backed up to 6 different servers. But even that small victory felt hollow in the face of the massive loss sprawled on the ground before them. The mother bear who'd brought them together, who'd trusted them with her most precious gift, was gone. And Enola, barely old enough to survive on his own, was now an orphan in a world that saw his kind as nothing more than obstacles to progress. Ayanna looked down at the grieving cub in her arms, then at the camera still broadcasting their tragedy to 250,000 viewers worldwide. Her name was Luna, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She was 15 years old, which I know because I rescued her as a cub after she was caught in illegal barbed wire. She remembered that kindness and returned it when her own baby needed help. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Enola's soft whimpering and the distant sound of federal agents reading rights to unrepentant men. Luna died protecting what she loved, Ayanna continued, gently stroking the orphaned cub's fur. She died believing that love was stronger than fear, that trust was more powerful than hatred, that some things were worth dying for. Her voice grew stronger, carrying the authority of someone who'd found her purpose in the depths of grief. But she also died believing that her baby would be safe, that the world still contained people willing to choose love over profit. Agent Chen approached the porch with the careful respect of someone entering sacred ground. "Mrs. Littlefeather, we'll need statements from all of you, but first, is there anything we can do for the cub?" Ayanna looked down at Enola, who'd finally exhausted himself crying and now slept fitfully against her chest. "We take care of him," she said simply. "We honor his mother's trust. We make sure her sacrifice means something. Ma'am, federal wildlife regulations require—" "Federal wildlife regulations," Ayanna interrupted gently but firmly, "don't account for sacred bonds or ancient promises. This cub's mother died trusting me to protect him. That's not a responsibility I'm going to hand over to bureaucrats who see him as a case number." The standoff might have continued, but Tommy stepped forward with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent months building legal groundwork. "Actually, Agent Chen, I think you'll find that Cherokee Nation wildlife sovereignty covers this situation, especially when combined with the federal investigation into Apex's systematic animal cruelty." Agent Chen studied the grieving family, human and ursine, gathered on the blood-stained porch. In her 15 years of environmental law enforcement, she'd seen plenty of corporate criminals and environmental destruction. But she'd rarely seen love this pure, grief this profound, or determination this unshakable. 48 hours, she said finally. We'll need documentation of proper care facilities and long-term plans. But given the exceptional circumstances, she looked at Luna's still form, then at the 250,000 people still watching the live stream. Some bonds transcend regulation. As federal agents led Brennan and his men away in handcuffs, Ayanna remained on her porch with Enola sleeping in her arms. The battle was won, but the war against a system that valued profit over life would continue. And somewhere in the forest, ancient spirits whispered that love, once awakened, was the most dangerous force in any world. The real fight was just beginning. The truth began unraveling 3 hours after Luna's body was removed by federal wildlife specialists, starting with a phone call that Agent Sarah Chen almost didn't answer. The number was blocked, the voice distorted, but the information was explosive enough to reshape everything they thought they knew about the Apex logging conspiracy. "Agent Chen?" The caller's voice was electronically modified, but the urgency was unmistakable. "You need to check the medical examiner's preliminary report on the bear. Look at the scarring patterns. Luna didn't just know Ayanna Littlefeather. She was the same cub from 15 years ago, the one documented in your cold case files. The line went dead, leaving Chen staring at her phone in the autumn afternoon light filtering through Ayanna's kitchen windows. Around the table sat the unlikely family that had formed in the wake of tragedy. Ayanna holding a sleeping Enola, Tommy reviewing legal documents with the focused intensity of someone building an unbreakable case, and Joe monitoring radio chatter from multiple federal agencies converging on what was rapidly becoming the environmental crime story of the decade. "What cold case files?" Ayanna asked, having overheard the conversation. Chen pulled out her laptop and began scrolling through databases with the efficient movements of someone who'd spent years tracking corporate criminals. In 2008, we investigated a series of animal cruelties in this area. Bears caught in illegal snares, cubs separated from mothers, systematic harassment designed to drive wildlife away from disputed land. We never found enough evidence for prosecution, but we documented everything. The first photograph that appeared on screen made Ayanna gasp. It showed a young black bear cub, maybe 6 months old, tangled in barbed wire with 3 distinctive parallel scars along her left shoulder. The same scars Joe had photographed on Luna just days earlier. "It's her," Ayanna whispered, tears flowing freely as the magnitude of Luna's trust became clear. She remembered. After all these years, she came home because she remembered being loved. But Tommy was studying the file details with the analytical mind that had made him successful in business. "Look at the dates," he said, pointing to timestamps on the photographs. "These incidents happened between October 2008 and March 2009. And look at the company that was clearing land in the area during that same period." Chen's expression darkened as she read, "Apex Logging Company. Preliminary permit applications for the same area they were trying to clear this week." She looked up from the screen with the grim realization of someone connecting dots that revealed a conspiracy years in the making. They'd been planning this for 15 years. The animal cruelty, the systematic harassment, the illegal trapping. It was all designed to establish a pattern of dangerous wildlife to justify future extermination orders. The second revelation came from Joe's radio, a transmission from the federal crime scene team that was still processing the logging equipment depot. "We've got a storage unit here filled with documentation." The voice crackled through static. "Looks like they kept records of everything. Every animal killed, every trap set, every bribe paid. And Agent Chen, you're going to want to see the photographs." 20 minutes later, Chen returned from the depot with the expression of barely controlled fury and a box of evidence that would eventually put 17 people in federal prison. But it was the manila folder she handed to Tommy that contained the truth that would finally explain why the past week had felt like destiny rather than coincidence. "Vehicle registration records from the night of March 15, 2009, she said quietly. "The night a young Cherokee man named Marcus Littlefeather died in a single-car accident on Highway 74. Tommy's hands trembled as he opened the folder, and Ayanna felt her world tilt as she recognized the implications. Marcus hadn't died in a random accident. He'd been murdered, killed because he'd discovered Apex's illegal operations and was planning to expose them. Marcus found their first operation, Tommy said, his voice hollow with 15 years of misdirected guilt. "He was coming to tell us what he'd discovered when they ran him off the road. They killed him because he tried to protect the bears." The third revelation was the most devastating because it came from Ayanna herself as she held Enola and watched the federal agents catalog evidence of a conspiracy that had cost her everything she'd loved. In the quiet space between heartbeats, surrounded by the detritus of corporate greed and environmental destruction, she finally understood the true scope of what they'd uncovered. It wasn't just about the logging rights, she said, her voice carrying the terrible clarity of someone seeing the complete picture for the first time. They needed the Cherokee families off the land before they could claim it. Marcus wasn't just a witness, he was an obstacle. A young Cherokee man who understood law, who had connections in environmental groups, who could organize resistance. Joe's military experience had taught him to recognize patterns of systematic elimination, and what Ayanna was describing fit the model perfectly. "They've been playing a long game," he said grimly. "Kill the leaders, terrorize the wildlife, make the land seem worthless and dangerous, then swoop in with cleanup contracts and development deals. But they made one mistake," Tommy said, looking up from financial documents that painted a picture of corruption reaching into state regulatory agencies and federal permitting offices. "They kept records of everything, every payment, every threat, every accident they arranged. It's all here." Chen was already on her phone, coordinating with federal prosecutors who specialized in RICO cases. The evidence was overwhelming. Conspiracy, murder, environmental terrorism, systematic corruption of public officials. Apex Logging wasn't just a company that had violated environmental regulations. It was a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for over a decade. But even as justice began its slow machinery, the family gathered in Ayanna's kitchen was processing a more personal revelation. Luna hadn't just returned to repay an old kindness. She'd come home to complete a circle of protection that began with Marcus's murder 15 years earlier. She was trying to finish what he started, Ayanna said, gently stroking Enola's fur as the orphaned cub slept against her chest. Marcus died trying to protect the bears, and Luna died trying to protect us. They were working together across species, across time, across death itself. The fourth and final revelation came as sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, when a Cherokee elder named Samuel Crow Feather arrived at Ayanna's cabin with a rolled bundle of buckskin and a story that put everything into spiritual context. "Grandmother Ayanna," he said formally, using the respectful address for a woman who'd earned her place as a keeper of sacred knowledge. "The tribal council has been in session since dawn, discussing what we witnessed today. But there's something else you need to know, something about your husband's final wishes." George Littlefeather, it turned out, had done more than leave behind grieving family when he died 8 months earlier. Working in secret with tribal lawyers and environmental groups, he'd established a legal trust that designated the family land as a sacred site under Cherokee spiritual law. The trust had been waiting for one specific condition to be activated: proof that corporate interests were systematically destroying wildlife on treaty land. "Your husband knew," Samuel explained, handing Ayanna the buckskin bundle. "He knew they would come for the land eventually, and he knew they would use the same methods they'd always used: violence against the defenseless, corruption of legal systems, elimination of anyone who stood in their way." Inside the bundle was a legal document that would change everything. A conservation easement worth $2 million, funded by a coalition of environmental groups and backed by federal protection under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. The land would remain in Ayanna's family forever, but it would also become a protected wildlife sanctuary with federal oversight. "The money?" Ayanna asked, still processing the magnitude of what her husband had accomplished. "Is specifically designated for wildlife rehabilitation and Cherokee cultural education," Samuel replied. "Your husband wanted to make sure that what happened to Luna's first family, what happened to Marcus, could never happen again." Tommy was crying openly now, 15 years of grief and guilt washing away as he finally understood that his father had never stopped fighting for their family, their land, their future. "He knew I'd come home," he whispered. "Somehow, he knew we'd all come home." As the evening deepened into night, federal agents continued their work of dismantling a criminal conspiracy that had operated in plain sight for 15 years. But in Ayana's kitchen, a different kind of justice was taking shape, the kind that comes from love persevering across time, death, and the seemingly impossible barriers between species. Enola stirred in Ayana's arms, blinking sleepy eyes that seemed far too wise for such a young creature. He looked around the room at the humans who'd become his family, then made a soft huffing sound that somehow conveyed both contentment and determination. "What do you think, little one?" Ayana asked softly. "Ready to help us build something your mama would be proud of?" The cub's response was to curl closer to her warmth, trusting in the same instinctive way his mother had trusted when she brought him to this place where love was stronger than greed. Outside, the forest was beginning its slow process of healing, but inside the cabin, 3 broken humans and 1 orphaned bear were discovering that some families are forged not by blood or law, but by the sacred bonds that form when beings choose to love each other against all odds. The real story was just beginning. 1 year later, on the anniversary of Luna's sacrifice, Ayana Littlefeather stood on the wooden platform overlooking what had become the Luna Memorial Wildlife Sanctuary, watching her grandson Enola teach his own cubs the ancient art of salmon fishing in the crystal-clear stream below. The transformation was so complete, so beautiful, that she sometimes had to pinch herself to believe it was real. The sanctuary now sprawled across 200 acres of protected Cherokee land, home to 12 black bear families, countless smaller mammals, and the dreams of a Cherokee grandmother who'd learned that love really could move mountains, or at least stop them from being clear-cut. The visitor center, built by Tommy's construction company using sustainable materials and traditional Cherokee architectural elements, welcomed over 50,000 people each year to witness the miracle of what happened when humans chose cooperation over exploitation. "Hard to believe it's only been a year," Joe said, settling into the chair beside her on the observation deck. At 59, he'd found a peace in these mountains that 15 years of therapy hadn't been able to provide. His daughter called him every Sunday now, and his 2 grandchildren spent summers at the sanctuary learning about wildlife conservation and Cherokee traditions. "Sometimes healing happens slowly," Ayana replied, watching Enola demonstrate the proper technique for cornering a particularly clever salmon. "Sometimes it happens all at once, like a sunrise after the longest night." At 66, she moved with the confident grace of someone who'd discovered her true calling. The sanctuary director position came with its challenges, but waking up each morning to the sound of healthy wildlife in protected forest made every bureaucratic headache worthwhile. Tommy approached from the main trail, his own transformation evident in every step. Gone were the expensive suits and desperate need to prove himself worthy of love. Instead, he wore work clothes that bore the honest stains of someone who built things that mattered. His construction company now specialized in eco-friendly buildings for tribal communities across the region, and his marriage to Sarah Two Eagles had given him the family acceptance he'd spent decades seeking in all the wrong places. "The dedication ceremony starts in 20 minutes, he reported, but his attention was fixed on the stream where Enola was sharing his catch with 2 younger cubs, not his biological offspring, but orphans he'd adopted with the same fierce protectiveness his mother had shown. "Channel 7 is here, plus representatives from 6 environmental groups and the Cherokee Nation Council." "And our special guest?" Ayana asked, though she could already see the distinctive government sedan making its way up the newly paved access road. "Agent Chen just pulled in," Joe confirmed. "Along with a very special surprise that I think you're going to love." The surprise turned out to be Marcus Brennan, though the man who stepped out of the federal transport van bore little resemblance to the corporate thug who'd terrorized these woods a year earlier. Prison had stripped away his arrogance and forced him to confront the consequences of 15 years spent choosing profit over human decency. More importantly, the federal plea agreement had required him to participate in restorative justice programs that brought him face to face with the communities he'd harmed. "Mrs. Littlefeather," he said quietly, his scarred face showing genuine remorse for perhaps the first time in his adult life. "I know there's nothing I can say that will bring back Luna or undo the pain I've caused. But I wanted you to know that your forgiveness made it possible for me to become someone my own children might someday be proud of." Ayanna studied the man who'd once represented everything evil about corporate environmental destruction. Prison had humbled him, but it was the victim impact statements, including a video of Luna's death that had been played in court 17 times, that had finally broken through his emotional armor and forced him to see the human cost of his choices. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting," she said carefully, choosing words that honored both justice and the Cherokee principle of giving people opportunities for redemption. "It's about refusing to let hatred poison the good work we're trying to do. Luna died protecting what she loved. The best way to honor her memory is to keep building something worthy of her sacrifice." The dedication ceremony itself was a blend of Cherokee tradition and modern environmental activism that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. Tribal elders blessed the land in ancient languages, while federal officials announced new protections for endangered species habitat. Children from 6 Cherokee communities released painted butterflies, while CNN live-streamed the event to an audience that had grown from Ayanna's original 250,000 viewers to over 3 million followers across multiple platforms. But the moment that brought tears to every eye was when Enola emerged from the forest with his adopted cubs, approaching the human gathering with the confidence of an animal who'd never known anything but love and protection from the strange two-legged creatures who shared his world. He sat at the edge of the ceremony circle, his cubs playing around him, living proof that trust once earned could be passed down through generations. 15 months ago," Ayanna said, addressing the crowd from the same porch where she'd live-streamed Luna's murder, "I was a bitter old woman preparing to lose everything that mattered to me. I thought my purpose had died with my husband and son. I thought the land my ancestors protected for centuries would be destroyed by men who saw only dollar signs where we saw sacred ground." The crowd, Cherokee families, environmental activists, federal officials, former Apex employees participating in court-ordered community service, listened with the respectful attention reserved for elders who'd earned their wisdom through fire. "But Luna taught me something that changed everything," Ayanna continued, her voice carrying across the sanctuary, where healthy bears fished in clean streams and children learned ancient songs. "Love doesn't end with death. It changes form. It becomes legacy. It becomes the choice we make every morning to build something better than what we inherited." Joe stepped forward to present the official federal designation of the sanctuary as a National Wildlife Research Station, complete with funding for graduate student programs and long-term habitat studies. Tommy announced the establishment of a scholarship fund for Cherokee students pursuing environmental law degrees. Agent Chen revealed that the evidence gathered from Apex's criminal activities had led to the largest environmental crime prosecutions in federal court history. But the most meaningful moment came when Samuel Crow Feather, speaking for the Cherokee Nation Council, formally adopted Enola into the tribe under ancient laws that recognized the spiritual bonds between humans and the animal relatives who shared their world. "In Cherokee tradition," Samuel explained, "family is not defined by blood, but by choice, by commitment, by the willingness to protect and provide for those who depend on us. Enola chose this family, and this family chose him. The spirits recognize no higher law than the law of love, freely given and gratefully received." As the afternoon wore on and official ceremonies gave way to informal celebrations, Ayana found herself sitting by the stream where it all began, watching Enola teach his cubs the same lessons Luna had taught him. The circle was complete, but it was also beginning again with each new generation that would grow up in a world where humans and wildlife coexisted rather than competed. Tommy approached with his infant son sleeping in a traditional Cherokee cradleboard, the next generation already being introduced to the sanctuary that would shape his understanding of what it meant to be a protector rather than a destroyer. "Dad would have loved this," he said quietly, using the word he'd been afraid to speak for 15 years. "George is here," Ayana replied, watching evening light paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Marcus, too. And Luna. They're all here in every choice we make to choose love over fear, in every life we protect, in every child we teach that the world is worth saving." As night settled over the sanctuary, the sounds of healthy wildlife filled the air, the splash of fish jumping, the rustle of small mammals foraging, the distant call of owls beginning their nocturnal hunts. It was the sound of life triumphant, of love persevering, of a future worth fighting for. Enola looked up from his fishing lesson and made the soft huffing sound that Ayana now recognized as his way of saying goodnight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that the bond between humans and the natural world could survive corporate greed and political corruption. But tonight, in a forest where ancient spirits walked among solar-powered research stations and traditional stories merged with modern conservation science, a Cherokee grandmother held her chosen grandson close and whispered the same lullaby she'd sung to Marcus all those years ago. Some love really was stronger than death. At 65, Ayana Littlefeather thought her story was over. Widowed, drowning in medical debt, facing the loss of her ancestral home with no family left to carry on her legacy. Sound familiar? Maybe you've felt that crushing loneliness of empty chairs at the dinner table, wondered if your life's work mattered, or feared that your golden years would be spent watching everything you built slip away. But sometimes, when we think we're too old to matter, too broken to heal, too alone to make a difference, life sends us an unexpected gift, wrapped in the most unlikely package. For Ayana, it was a desperate mother bear trusting her with a dying cub. What followed wasn't just a rescue. It was a resurrection of purpose, family, and hope that proved love doesn't expire with age. Today, at 66, Ayana runs a thriving wildlife sanctuary, has reunited with her long-lost son, and discovered that becoming a grandmother doesn't require grandchildren. It requires an open heart. Your story isn't over either. The most beautiful chapters might still be unwritten, waiting for that moment when you choose love over fear, purpose over resignation, hope over despair. Questions for you. What empty chair in your life could become space for new love to grow? When did you last feel truly needed by someone or something that mattered? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what another soul needs to hear today.